So, today what I'm just going to walk through is a baseline version of some of the concepts that are covered in your Chapter 6 material. Um, this will specifically highlight some of the concepts that we'll utilize throughout the whole semester, while simultaneously covering some of the things, or I'll focus on some of the things that I think students tend to struggle with a little bit more in this content area. So the first thing that's going to be very important for us throughout the semester is our GDP breakdown. And so the thing that we utilize, or the method that we utilize to calculate GDP, is called the expenditure approach. And that's given by this formula here. In your slides, you'll note that there's essentially three equivalent ways to work through this. This one provides us with the greatest salience so we can break down the impact of different policies. It also directly connects us to one portion of our model, that being the aggregate demand model. And so as a result, this just becomes our go-to. So those three equivalent ways, they're great, but our focus will be on the expenditure approach. And that's comprised of the following variables. You have consumption or consumer spending, investment, or you'll see this in your slides, it's also noted as business spending. The important thing with investment is to note that this doesn't deal with the investments that you particularly think of when you are talking about your 401k or how you're putting things towards your retirement. This investment deals more so with private business spending towards their own capital or towards their own labor. It's reinvesting reinvesting those funds back into the business itself. Then we have our government spending. Government spending deals with all of the elements that go into the government's budget. You can think about our mandatory things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, but also we have our discretionary elements which deal with your military spending, your education spending, and then we also have some of our welfare programs built into that as well. All of these first three here, are all additive, meaning as we increase these variables, these are going to increase the level of GDP. If these drop, then these are going to drop the level of GDP. The last one's the only one you have to be a little careful with. It's made up of two variables, and we put them in parentheses in order to designate the order of operations. First things first, you have your exports, things that are produced within U.S. borders and sold to other countries. And then your imports, goods that are produced in other countries and imported and purchased by firms in the U.S. We can have three different relationships here. If your exports exceed your imports, then your country is operating in a trade surplus. These are your country, our most common example would be to look at China, who exports more relative to their imports. For us, in the US, this second option tends to be how we operate. Where our exports, what we sell to other countries, are less than what we buy from other countries. And so whenever we're operating in this way, we call this a trade deficit. Make sure this is easy to see. And then our last one could be a perfectly balanced trade. And so just be careful whenever you're utilizing information in different questions to be able to do these different calculations. Your first quiz is really easy because it's all multiple choice, but when we get to the more short answer sections, then you want to be careful. Make sure to properly assign the values here so that you don't accidentally flip one of these variables and miscalculate GDP. But this is how we go about calculating it. It's relatively straightforward. Just make sure that we allocate the information correctly, and also, as we're interpreting these impacts, we want to make sure that we note the different compositions of GDP for different countries. Next, the second concept that I think tends to get people tripped up is calculating real GDP. Whenever we make this adjustment here for real GDP, all we're doing is we are adjusting for inflation. So, real GDP tends to be the metric that we utilize more often than not. In order to calculate that, the formula is straightforward. You take your nominal GDP. The only thing that tends to trip students up is make sure that we have these in parentheses and that we do this order of operations correctly. We do our price index divided by 100. Once we calculate that value, then we take our nominal GDP divided by that. So, for our purposes in our class, you can kind of treat this as an identity. And what I mean by that is, like, don't treat it that way in practice, but for our class, whenever I ask you to make an adjustment for inflation or calculate real GDP, I'm not asking you to go through a bunch of different price indices. I'm asking you to use the GDP deflator. And so in questions that are focused on short answer around this concept, this will be provided. The GDP deflator, or the price index, just measures the average increase or decrease in the price level of all goods in the economy. And so the GDP deflator is the best price index for principles of macro because it takes into account all goods. Things like the consumer price index are much better for you to utilize if you're thinking about how to account for inflation for purchasing different consumer products like cars, refrigerators, etc. But the GDP deflator works best when you're trying to get a sense of the aggregate output in an economy. So that's the setup. The formula is relatively straightforward. I have a couple examples in the slides. The big thing to note is that we really want to make sure that we operate this bottom part first. So for example, let's say you go through and you calculate nominal GDP. So you go through, you calculate nominal GDP, and you get something like a really simple outline of $100. $100 in output for your nominal GDP. And your GDP deflator is 89. You get a GDP deflator of 89. All you're going to do from that point is calculate your real GDP. Make sure we're doing this denominator part first, and so I'll take my 89 divided by 100, and when I put that into my formula over here, I get 100 divided by 0.89. This will give you a good sense, or it'll give you a good sense of like what the relative price level is doing. If your GDP deflator is something like this example here, 89, then that means that the price level that you're utilizing is lower than your current price level or your base year's price level. If it's higher, then that means that the price level is greater than your base year's price level. And so that gives you a sense of like which direction the inflation level is moving, but it will always depend on the question at hand. And so when you're looking at these in the slides, I don't want you to get too overwhelmed with this little example here. This example, or whatever's given with respect to this GDP deflator in this base year, is arbitrary. You choose your reference year. So just for example, in this slide, we've chosen 2005 to be our base year. And so the price index for that base year is 100. If we would have chosen 2010 to be the base year, then the GDP deflator, or price index for 2010, would be 100. So whatever year you choose as your base year, that's going to set that price index at 100, and everything after that is going to be subject to the changes in the price level. In our example here, goods in 1960, the average price level are much cheaper than they were in 2005, and so the price index reflects that with this much lower number. After 2005, we experienced some positive inflation, and so the price index after 2005 is greater. That's all we really need to know for these two concepts. They're kind of the most important from this unit. But if you do run into any questions about these concepts, just shoot me an email or stop by during office hours. Thanks.